Welcome back to Koala Moon. I'm Abbe. Tonight we have our cuddliest bedtime stories, a super cozy collection to help kids sleep. Before we get started, can I ask a teeny favour? If you love our stories, please quickly tap subscribe. Subscribing shows YouTube how much you value our channel, which will help our stories reach more people just like you. So please tap subscribe now. Thank you. Now, shall we settle down, get cosy and begin? Cuddle the Puggles Community Garden by Jane Thomas. Cuddle the Puggle scratched her head with a pencil. She looked across at her friend Kevin, a bouncy young kangaroo, and he shrugged his shoulders. Nobody in the class seemed to know the answer to Mrs. Bloomington's question. "Come on, dears," said the big fuzzy bumblebee, buzzing to a halt and landing on her desk at the front of the class. "I'm sure you must know. Why are bumblebees so important?" Cuddle raised a tentative hand. Mrs. Bloomington nodded eagerly. "Well," said Puggle, Is it because bumblebees know a lot and teach us things, like you, Mrs. Bloomington?" The bumblebee on the teacher's desk adjusted her glasses and sighed. She should have seen that one coming. "You're half right, dear. Well done for trying. I was really hoping that someone would know just how much bees do. Without us, there would be no trees and wildflowers. And without those, there would be no insects. And without insects, there would be no birds or animals." The class was clearly impressed as they all sat there with their mouths open. Mrs. Bloomington finished with a flourish and soared up towards the fluffy white cotton wool clouds that hung over the children's heads. "Without bumblebees, there would be no sleepy forest." The class then set about one of Mrs. Bloomington's favourite Friday afternoon games. She would hold up a picture of a flower and they would all try and name it. The first was a gorgeous, complicated-looking thing with lots of pink and white and some dashes of gold in the centre. "Yes," she said to an eager beaver in the corner, "it was indeed honeysuckle." The next was a whole field of rows of purple flowers. The flowers glowed with a golden light in the background, as if the picture had been painted just as the sun was starting to set. "Yes," she said to Kevin, who bounced up and down in his chair until she finally picked him. It was lavender. The class went through a whole range of pictures, identifying wild roses and golden dandelions, delicate sky blue forget-me-nots, and gorgeous pink fluffy buddleia. "And what else is that known as?" Mrs. Bloomington asked, and the whole class stretched their hands to the air and then said in a chorus, "It's a butterfly bush." They could name flowers that didn't even grow in Sleepy Forest and that they'd only seen in pictures. They could name flowers by their important names and their friendly names, and even some of their Latin names. This was a class who had learned a lot from Mrs. Bloomington, and who hung on every word the fuzzy black and yellow bumblebee said. There couldn't be many young creatures around the world who knew that Anthriscus sylvestris was often called cow parsley, which was also called, far more prettily, Queen Anne's lace. And Mrs. Bloomington was sure that very few other creatures would recognize the sunshine yellow shapes of Linaria vulgaris, and that it was known by some as common toadflax, and by others as, far more whimsically, butter and eggs. Flowers were the very centre of Mrs. Bloomington's world, and she wanted to be sure that her class knew that, whether they liked it or not, flowers were very much at the centre of their world too. So a few days later, when Cuddle and Kevin came up to her after class and presented her with the idea to create a small garden at the edge of the playing fields, it is hardly surprising that Mrs. Bloomington was very excited by it. She immediately buzzed her way across the fields, Cuddle and Kevin rushing to keep up so that they could show her the patch of ground that was neither used for one thing nor another. It was where the children of Kookaburra sometimes disappeared to if they wanted to share a secret or just have a few moments away from the busyness of the world. "You see," said Cuddle, "you said that flowers are important, and we thought we could put some here, and, well, that might be good." "Just think how pretty it will look, too," said Kevin, bouncing along the edge and indicating where they could plant lilies and roses and lavender. The next day, during their lunch break, the rest of the school watched as Mrs. Bloomington's class walked in a long line across the playing fields. Some were carrying plants, safely wrapped up in little terracotta pots, and others were carrying spades or forks, and an alligator at the back pushed a wheelbarrow in front of him, and the other animals took it in turns to jump in and out of the wheelbarrow and be pushed along for a few meters, before somebody else leapt up with a, "My turn, my turn." There was a flurry of activity for all of 30 minutes, and when the class had finished and were walking back across the playing fields, armed with the spades and forks and wheelbarrows, but none of the plants, children rushed across to see what had been done. They saw the little patch of forgotten ground had become really rather glorious, all bright colours and flowers turning themselves towards the sun. And in no time at all, word got around to the bees and butterflies, and they fluttered and buzzed over to enjoy the new garden. Cuddle was very proud to tell Snuggle and Huggle later that evening that it was her and Kevin's idea to create the little garden. And it was Snuggle who said, wow, they had done such a wonderful job in such a short space of time. Why didn't they try and do something bigger? Cuddle was rolling the idea around in her mind the next morning when she went to catch the alligator bus to school. Apollo came into view, cap in place, slowly moving his way along the river of tranquility, and Cuddle and her brother and sister hopped aboard and leaned back against the scales. Cuddle stared out at the riverbank as they passed by, looking at the gardens that stretched from the backs of distant houses and all the way down to meet the river. In some there were benches where koalas and kangaroos sat with their morning coffee, enjoying a moment of peace as the sun slowly rose in the sky. In others there were colourful garden sheds or greenhouses made of glass that glinted and shone. There were flowers in pots and flowers in baskets and flowers in beds. And in some gardens there were neat rows of canes where beans wound their way up and raspberries clung. At the next stop, Kevin climbed onto Apollo's back and shimmied along until he was sitting next to Cuddle. And as they set off, Apollo, careful to weave his tail very gently in the water, Cuddle gripped Kevin's arm and said, "Look, over there." Kevin followed her gaze and saw, well, he saw nothing at all, really. There was a bit of earth and a load of weeds and a couple of bushes that looked as if they'd been very much forgotten for a very long time. "What if," whispered Cuddle to him, "what if we made a bigger garden, one that everybody could use? Don't you think that's the perfect place?" Kevin looked back over his shoulder at the patch of land now retreating into the distance. He tried to work out where it must be and realized that if you walked to the far side of the land, you'd come to the back of Betty's bakery. For a moment he closed his eyes, almost smelling the fresh bread and seeing the lines of shining glazed donuts, imagining cookies and muffins and cakes drift right in front of him. Focus, Kevin, focus, he told himself. A garden for everybody, Cuddle had said. By the time they reached the school gates, barely remembering to wave goodbye to Snuggle and Huggle, they were so deep in conversation, Cuddle and Kevin had dreamed up an entire garden together. It would have seats where people could sit and enjoy the space, and flowers to make the place beautiful, and rows of vegetables and fruits that anyone who needed them could come and eat. And if everyone just did a very little bit of work, it was something that could be created in no time and looked after easily. A lot of little easy things would add up to one big amazing thing. They couldn't wait to tell Mrs. Bloomington all about their idea. But they would have to wait until after break time, because as soon as they walked into the classroom, Mrs. Bloomington was already buzzing her way into a busy morning. She had handed out maps of the world and was calling out the countries children had to find. She liked to do this on what she called World Wednesdays. Mrs. Bloomington always started with the easiest countries, the really big ones like America and China and Australia. And then she would move on to slightly trickier ones like Mexico and France and India. The class had done this so many times, they could almost do it with their eyes closed now. They waited eagerly, pens poised, while Mrs. Bloomington chose some of the really difficult countries like Togo and Myanmar and Austria. And then she would pick some of the island countries for them to find, and everyone disappeared into daydreams of coconuts and palm trees, and golden sand beaches, and turquoise seas, as they found St. Lucia, and Vanuatu, and Zanzibar. At break time, Mrs. Bloomington always found excuses to buzz around her desk in case anybody wanted to talk with her. And today, Cuddle and Kevin were the first in line. They told her all about their garden idea and the bit of ground they'd seen while taking the bus to school. And what did she think, and could it happen? And when might they start? They were so eager and excited that everything spilled out in the wrong order, and it took a while for the fuzzy bumblebee to really understand what they were saying. But at last, the jumble of words all made sense, and she buzzed a little buzz of excitement. "You mean like a community garden?" she said. And Cuddle said she supposed that, yes, she did mean that. And Mrs. Bloomington said it was a wonderful idea indeed. She would see if she could find out who the land belonged to and if it might work, and let them know as soon as she could. Fortunately, impatient little Cuddle and Kevin didn't need to wait long, because Mrs. Bloomington disappeared during the lunch break and went rushing over to the bakery. She inspected the land before going inside and talking to the owner, Betty Badger, who went and flipped the sign from open to closed on the door and followed the excited bumblebee outside. "Yes," she said, "the land did belong to the bakery, and therefore to her, and it would be rather lovely to have it made into something useful, rather than be filled with weeds and bare patches of earth doing nothing much at all." Many other animals saw the badger and the bumblebee going back and forth over the ground, and they came to see what was happening. So, by the time Mrs. Bloomington went back to school for the afternoon's lessons, she had promises of seeds and flowers and canes and wood and all the things that would be needed to make a glorious garden for everyone. Word spread quickly around the school that over the weekend, anyone who wanted to help create some magic could meet behind the bakery. And when Cuddle stepped onto Apollo that Saturday morning, there was barely any room for her, because it seemed as if half the forest had come out to help. Creatures came from all directions with wheelbarrows and bags of earth and forks and spades and buckets and all the things they thought would be useful. The first task was removing all the weeds and clearing the space so that they could start afresh. A group of herons volunteered themselves, and they strode slowly through the overgrown patches, leaning down and plucking weeds out with their long, probing beaks. Then the soil needed to be tilled, and moles stepped forwards, hard hats at the ready, pointing out that they were the perfect creatures for this task. They worked in a long line, each rumbling along in the ground and pushing it upwards in perfectly sifted mounds, so it would be easy to dig and plant and sow the seeds. As they worked, the herons at the head of the line and the moles following close behind, Mrs. Bloomington rolled out a huge diagram she had drawn up. It showed a map of the area and where everything should go, and the creatures studied it carefully so they knew exactly where to plant the potatoes and the beans, the apple trees and the pineapple plants, the chives and rosemary and coriander. They looked at where the flower beds were going to go and saw how Mrs. Bloomington had cleverly planned to put the tallest plants at the back and the smaller plants towards the front, so everything would get enough light to be able to grow as big and beautiful as possible. There was a small area where she had even drawn in a pond, and she explained that this was perhaps a dream too far. But no, said a group of spoon-billed storks, pink feathers fluttering with pride. This is what their beaks had been designed to do, and a pond she should have. Once the herons had cleared the ground and the moles had tilled the soil, Cuddle and Kevin found themselves rushing from project to project, wanting to be a part of everything. They learned to lean the bamboo canes and tie the tops together, ready for the beans to pull themselves up. A gruff old badger explained all about companion planting, and they watched as he put marigolds alongside tomatoes and carrots next to leeks, bright blue borage next to strawberry plants, and thyme was teamed up with roses. It would ensure, he explained, that each of the plants would grow as well as it possibly could because they worked together. Cuddle announced she was going to be known as Calendula, and Kevin must be Courgette, because they were best friends and they worked well together too. But Kevin, much as he adored her, refused to be called Courgette. "I'm Kevin," he said. "Kev in an emergency. Kevlar if you have to. Kevstar if you must. But never, ever Courgette." Fair enough, thought Cuddle, although she did plan to go home that evening and change the note she'd written on the first page of her diary from "The Tales of Cuddle and Kevin" to "The Secret Lives of Calendula and Courgette." A group of beavers worked together in a corner to create a series of benches to put around the garden, munching their way through tree trunks and branches to create the perfect seats. The mongoose who ran the hardware shop had donated some cans of paint to the project, and Cuddle helped Koko the koala and his family paint the benches cornflower blue and sage green and buttercup yellow. The beavers also helped to cut the wood needed to build a little gazebo that would go right beside the river. This would be a place where animals could sit and watch the alligator buses glide to and fro, and see the turquoise feathers of kingfishers as they darted around, and the emerald and ruby flashes of dragonflies rushing up and down. Weaver birds showed the others how to take long yellow straws and ease them together, working them round and round until baskets had been created. These would all be left just at the back of the bakery, so anybody arriving would be able to take a basket down to the areas where the vegetables grew and easily carry the potatoes and onions pulled fresh from the ground, the grapes and raspberries taken straight from the vine, and the cherries and apples plucked right off the tree. When she saw all the work that had been done to transform the rough patch of ground into such a beautiful garden, Betty was quite overcome. She was so inspired by what Cuddle and Kevin had done that she wanted to do more, even more than she had already done in providing the land. She went and spoke with Buck the beaver, who nodded his head up and down and set back to work on a new set of branches. He created a box with a lid on hinges that lifted easily, and inside Mrs. Sugarplum promised to put 5 fresh loaves of bread every morning. Whoever needed one could come and take it, no questions asked. Of course, word of this soon got around, for bumblebees are not only excellent teachers and the little creatures that keep the world alive, but also some of the busiest gossips out there. So by the time the evening was starting to draw in and the final finishing touches were being put to the garden, a hanging basket here, a plant pot there, 3 more boxes had been added alongside the one for Mrs. Sugarplum's bread. The cheesemonger mouse promised to add a selection of cheeses to a box each day, and the hens had promised to leave cartons of freshly laid eggs every morning. And Mr. Bliss, owner of the Sugar Dreams candy store, would slip a few bars of chocolate into a box each and every day. It had taken a single comment from Mrs. Bloomington to her class at the Kookaburra Kindy for everything to snowball, until it went from a small flower garden on the edge of the school playing fields to a wonderful garden filled with all the fruits and vegetables and flowers and food that everyone in the whole of Sleepy Forest could share. And that is how things happen, you see. A single idea that is shared and rolled around a little can transform into something far bigger than anyone might have dreamed. Now, after the alligator bus had stopped to pick up Kevin, he and Cuddle both looked across at the little garden they helped to bring to life. They know that on Mondays there will be a group of elderly koalas sitting in the gazebo playing cards. They know that on Tuesdays there's a knitting circle who meet there to, as they say, knit and natter. On Wednesdays, they're likely to see a pair of very old otters who will be wearing, whatever the weather, scarves wrapped around their necks and mittens on their paws, peering out at the water and the world through tiny round glasses. On Thursdays, badgers meet in the gazebo to play dominoes, and Cuddle and Kevin hear the group before they've even seen them. the clack of the tiles being slammed down onto the table echoing up and down Sleepy River. And on Friday, as regular as clockwork, moles sit alongside each other and pore over the newspapers, reading snippets aloud to the others, and then burying themselves back into the stories of the day. Betty has timed her outings to the bread box, so she will always see the alligator bus gliding past on the school run. And she waves at the puggle and her kangaroo friend, who were, as she's been told, the dreamers of the dream that created this magical garden. Cuddle will never quite know the number of lives she's changed. She will never know how many animals slip into the garden at different times of day, taking the woven baskets and filling them with vegetables pulled fresh from the ground, and leaning into the boxes to take home a treat of cheese or chocolate. She will never know just how many creatures sit on the cornflower blue bench and feel a deep sense of peace, being surrounded by the flowers and the bees and the butterflies. And she will never know just who it is who makes sure the growing beans are always wrapped around their canes, or keeps the jasmine and the honeysuckle covering the arches and trellises in perfect formation. And she will never really know how many people secretly whisper a heartfelt thank you as they leave the garden, refreshed and ready to go back to their lives again. But she does know for sure that the adventures of Calendula and Courgette have only just begun. Because every night, before she falls asleep, she writes another idea in her diary and tucks it away beneath her pillow. And she disappears into dreams where everyone is kind and giving and loving, and where butterflies rest on a field of lavender, and bees cover themselves in the softest mounds of yellow pollen, and slowly, wonderfully, keep the entire world turning with a sprinkling of magic dust and a scattering of stars. This is Guinea Pigs in Paris by Alicia Ainsley. Hamlet and Toots were class guinea pigs who lived in a hutch inside a classroom owned by a teacher called Miss Fudge. Miss Fudge was an excellent teacher, and Hamlet and Toots adored sitting in on her lessons every day, along with the children. In summer, the school closed for 6 weeks, which meant that Hamlet and Toots could go on some pretty special vacations. They'd been all over the United Kingdom on holiday. They had been to the Highlands of Scotland and the beaches of Cornwall, stayed in caravans in the Welsh valleys and cottages in the Lake District. However, this year, Miss Fudge was taking them somewhere rather different for the summer. This year, she was taking the guinea pigs with her to France. Hamlet and Toots had never been to France before, but Miss Fudge had been there many times. Her parents lived in France and owned an apartment in the heart of the capital city, Paris. As soon as the 2 guinea pigs found out the location of their summer vacation, they immediately started researching the European country and brushing up on their French phrases. On the last day of school term, they packed their suitcases and prepared to leave the classroom for the summer. "Ah, Paris," Hamlet gushed theatrically. "Le Tour d'Eiffel, l'Arc de Triomphe, le City of Love. I cannot wait." Toots rolled her eyes, amused. Hamlet had been pretending he was French for days. He'd even packed a beret and a blue and white striped shirt in his little suitcase. "You must get in character too," Hamlet insisted, handing Toots a red scarf to tie around her neck and a pair of snazzy white sunglasses. Toots giggled and shook her head in defiance, but she had to admit the accessories looked quite fashionable. Maybe she would pack them in her suitcase after all. "What do you want to do in Paris?" Toots asked Hamlet sweetly. "I would love to sit under the Eiffel Tower and eat a picnic." Hamlet handed her a small piece of paper and declared proudly, "I have already made us an itinerary." Toots scanned the to-do list Hamlet had created. They would go to a bakery and eat fresh croissants, walk along the River Seine, see the Mona Lisa at the Louvre Art Museum, wander beneath the Arc de Triomphe, plus a few other touristy things. Luckily, visiting the Eiffel Tower was on the list. "Please can we add having a picnic to the list?" Toots requested sweetly. Hamlet stuck a fake curly moustache on his top lip and pretended to twizzle it as he replied in a French accent, "We'll see if we have time." At the end of the school day, Miss Fudge picked up the guinea pig cage and carried Hamlet and Toots home with her. The next morning, she packed up their passports and they rode a ferry over the English Channel to France. Hamlet and Toots had never been abroad, so when they saw the coast of France appear in the watery distance from the side of the boat, they raced around their cage in excitement. "We're almost there! We're almost French guinea pigs!" Hamlet celebrated. Toots laughed and replied, "We don't automatically become French just because we step foot in France, Hamlet." Hamlet dug his beret out of his suitcase and fitted it firmly on his fuzzy head. "Aha! But we can pretend to be French," he responded. "It is the role of a lifetime." Once off the ferry, Miss Fudge and the guinea pigs travelled into Paris and eventually reached the door of Miss Fudge's family apartment. Her parents lived on the 3rd floor of a tall, white stone building amidst hundreds of other identical apartment blocks. Miss Fudge's family apartment was spacious, with big windows that gazed out on the streets below, and there was a small iron balcony for every room. As soon as they'd settled into their holiday home, Hamlet and Toots enjoyed a cup of milk on the balcony, watching people below potter along the cobbled streets of Paris. It was blissful. "C'est la vie," Hamlet announced with adoration. "What does that mean?" Toots inquired. "It means this is the life," Hamlet answered wistfully. Toots pulled out her French phrase book from her bag. It was probably about time she brushed up on her bonjours and au revoirs, ready for tomorrow's tour of Paris. The following morning, after a delightful night's sleep, Miss Fudge, Hamlet and Toots all prepared for their day out in Paris. Miss Fudge had plans with her parents, so the guinea pigs could easily slip out and do as they pleased. Hamlet was eager to start ticking things off their Paris to-do list. He dressed in his blue and white striped top, dusted off his beret, and reapplied glue to his fake moustache, while Toots wore a pretty white dress and retrieved the sunglasses and red scarf that Hamlet had given her. She twirled in front of the mirror and admired herself. Toots looked very Parisian, if she did say so herself. Hamlet gasped and exclaimed, Toots, you look magnifique. Toots thanked him for his kind compliment, and they toddled out into the streets of Paris together. Hamlet consulted his to-do list and decided they had to start the day with croissants from a boulangerie. The guinea pigs sashayed down the street to the bakery, saying bonjour to everyone they passed. They got a few funny looks. After all, it's not every day that you see a couple of guinea pigs wandering the streets of Paris. But Hamlet and Toots didn't care. They were too pleased to be here to notice anything outside of their own happy bubble. They bought 2 fresh, flaky croissants from the boulangerie and paid with some euros that Toots had in her purse. Hamlet had been too busy learning how to act like a French guinea pig to research the details of their trip. Luckily, Toots had been organised enough to check what currency the French paid for things in, and made sure she took some euros out from the bank before their trip. They walked along the River Seine as they ate their croissants, and they declared that these were indeed the best croissants they had ever tasted. The River Seine ran through the middle of Paris, and boats lazily sailed along its waters, under beautiful stone bridges, and past famous monuments. Toots gasped as she watched a boat glide by, and said, "Could we take a ride on a boat along the Seine, Hamlet? It will be a relaxing way of seeing things." Hamlet referred to his list. "We could," he contemplated. "But if we do that, then we won't have time to tick off everything else on the list. Shall we see if we have time later?" Toots nodded and nibbled her croissant. It would be a shame if they ran out of time to do everything. Instead, she imagined what it might be like to ride a boat along the River Seine. She closed her eyes and pictured herself standing at the front of the deck, holding onto the railings. The sun in the sky warmed her face, and the cool breeze flowed through her fur, wafting her red neck scarf out behind her. She looked like a movie star with her sunglasses on, and the people on the shore waved to her and took photos with adoration. Her fantasy was mesmerizing, but she was broken from her reverie as Hamlet announced that they must make haste to their next stop, the Arc de Triomphe. The 2 guinea pigs bustled along the edge of the River Seine and eventually spotted a tall monument in the distance. It wasn't the Eiffel Tower, but another huge historical monument, the Arc de Triomphe. The Arc de Triomphe was a majestic stone arch with images and statues carved into its surface. It was set upon a large circular platform, and cars and taxis slowly wound around the roundabout surrounding it. It was an impressive piece of architecture, and tourists walked underneath its base, in and out of the archway, admiring its artistry up close. "Can we walk up to the top of it?" Toots suggested, noticing some people standing on the roof of the giant arch. Hamlet replied, "Of course, Toots. If that is what you want, then that is what we shall do." Toots clapped her little claws with glee. They made their way up to the top of the Arc de Triomphe and paused at the balcony's edge to take in the view. From up here, the guinea pigs could gaze out over the whole of Paris. The views were sublime. Toots and Hamlet could see the roofs of all the houses and the way the river sparkled in the sunlight. Toots took a big breath of the morning air and sighed happily. She could smell freshly baked bread and delicate flower pollen floating on the breeze. Her fluffy body felt calm after walking around the streets for so long. Just as Toots was becoming lost in the moment, Hamlet said that it was time to move on. They returned to the ground, and just as they were about to walk away from the Arc de Triomphe, Hamlet stopped and announced, "Let me take a photo of you." Toots scurried to stand in the middle of the Arc de Triomphe and posed for the camera. Hamlet snapped away on his Polaroid camera and gushed, "Toots, you look fabulous, like a movie star." Toots's confidence soared, and she experimented with all sorts of poses for the camera. She liked being a guinea pig in Paris. When she returned to Hamlet's side, he showed her the small Polaroid photos that had been printed out of the camera, and she grinned. She looked wonderful. "Would you like me to take some photos of you, Hamlet?" she offered. However, Hamlet tucked his camera away in his bag and replied, "No, merci. I will only break the camera." Then the determined guinea pig led the way down the street towards the metro station. The metro was a train that ran along tunnels underneath the ground of Paris. Hamlet and Toots were fascinated by it. They had assumed that only special animals got to go underground, like rabbits and worms. But here they were, a couple of guinea pigs, riding on an underground train. "Where are we going now?" Toots asked Hamlet. He smiled mischievously and replied, "It is a surprise." They rode the train and enjoyed the chugging motion of the wheels on the track. The gentle bobbing of the carriage made Hamlet and Toots feel like they were being cradled and swayed by the students in Miss Fudge's class when they enjoyed their afternoon snuggles. It was so relaxing that they quickly drifted off for a nap, resting their heads on each other's fuzzy shoulders. After some time, the train stopped at the end of the line, and the guinea pigs hopped out of the carriage and into the metro station. "It is a good job the last stop was the last one," Hamlet admitted with a chuckle. "Otherwise, we would have missed it." Toots was still none the wiser about where they were headed next. Where could they possibly be now? They surely weren't still in the centre of Paris after such a long metro ride. When they emerged from the underground station, the sound of riveting, joyful music filled the air, and a set of large, multicoloured gates stood in front of them. Two huge mice waved their little white-gloved hands at them and welcomed them in. It was a theme park. Toots had always wanted to go to a theme park. As if reading her mind, Hamlet reached into his bag and pulled out 2 tickets, holding them up excitedly. "Surprise!" he grinned. Toots gasped and raised her little claws to her cheeks in delight. "Quelle surprise!" she responded delightedly. Hamlet announced, "Let's go," as he guided Toots through the entrance gate. The guinea pigs had a whale of a time at the theme park, riding roller coasters, eating ice cream, and exploring fantastical make-believe lands. "This is even more fun than running in our exercise wheel," Toots exclaimed as one roller coaster zoomed them backwards around its track. The theme park was everything Toots could have dreamed of, and more. Hamlet had made a great choice by adding this spot to the list. After they had experienced their fill of attractions, Hamlet and Toots headed back to the metro, equally exhilarated and exhausted. They couldn't wait to get on the train and savour a nice long nap again. Back in the centre of Paris, Toots and Hamlet consulted their list. It wasn't complete yet, and they were eager to make the most of their day out in Paris. Who knew when they would have this opportunity again? The next place on Hamlet's list was an art museum called the Louvre. Amongst its collection of famous pieces of art, it possessed the world's most famous painting, the Mona Lisa. To enter the museum, they had to walk through a glass pyramid down to the underground vaults. It was very fancy. "The Parisians like to spend a lot of time underground, don't they?" Hamlet commented as they descended the stairs inside the pyramid. Hamlet and Toots toddled around the halls, admiring the art on the walls. Toots longed to stop and spend time at each painting, but Hamlet had only one in mind. He found the Mona Lisa and called Toots over to join him. They had to push their way to the front of a crowd, but luckily, being guinea pigs meant they could easily slip through people's feet and stand at the front. The Mona Lisa was a painting by an artist called Leonardo da Vinci, and it was of a human woman with dark hair staring out of the painting. "She looks so mysterious," Toots said, observing the Mona Lisa's half-smile. Hamlet nodded. "That's why it's so famous," he said. "Nobody knows who she is, or why she's smiling like that." Toots could have happily stayed at the museum for the rest of the afternoon, inspecting the paintings. But, as always, Hamlet was in a rush to move on to the next thing. "Allez, Toots," he ordered. "We have one more place to go." Toots sighed and trudged slowly behind him. She was particularly tired now and asked Hamlet if they could miss the last thing on his to-do list. But Hamlet took her hand, gave it a squeeze, and replied, "I promise this will be worth it." The guinea pigs left the Louvre Museum and the Mona Lisa behind to take a stroll through a beautiful green and yellow tree-lined garden. There were spurting water fountains, long grassy lawns, and pretty flower beds surrounding majestic statues. They slowly walked together, perusing the lovely things around them, and stopped now and then to admire the sights properly. It felt like the first time all day they had explored Paris at a slower pace and truly taken it in. They crossed a bridge over the river and waved to the people on a passing boat below. For a moment, with her red scarf fluttering in the wind, Toots felt like a movie star, just as she had in her earlier fantasy. Finally, they reached the Eiffel Tower, the most famous landmark in the whole of France. The tall, triangular tower was effortlessly pretty against the backdrop of Paris. The iron structure pointed into a tip towards the sky, and the hundreds of lattices that made it up looked like pretty patterns from afar. Hamlet and Toots jumped in a lift and rose to the second level of the Eiffel Tower before climbing the stairs as high as it was possible to go. At the top, they stood at the balcony's edge and looked out over Paris. It was an immensely beautiful city, and the two guinea pigs sighed with appreciation. "I think this is my favourite city in the world," Hamlet proclaimed dreamily. Toots responded, "Isn't this the only city you've been to?" But Hamlet contentedly replied, "I don't need to see any more. Nowhere could possibly top Paris." After a while, they descended the Eiffel Tower. The afternoon was drawing to a close, but the sun still shone brightly in the sky. The long summer's day felt like it may never end. Toots yawned and asked if they were heading back to the apartment now. But Hamlet grinned and replied, "There's just one more thing left to do." He gestured to a lone red blanket in the middle of the grass, right in front of the Eiffel Tower. On the blanket was a wicker basket, filled with an assortment of cheese, bread, and fruit. Hamlet whispered, "You mentioned that you would like to have a picnic beneath the Eiffel Tower. So here you go." Toots almost cried with happiness. Hamlet had remembered her one request, and it was even more perfect than she could have planned herself. The guinea pigs sat down on the blanket and enjoyed their delicious picnic, whilst watching the sun slowly set behind the majestic Eiffel Tower. "Shall we take a photo together?" Hamlet suggested. Toots smiled and replied, "I thought you said you would break the camera." "Ah, but this is a special moment. I want to remember it always," he answered. Hamlet pulled the camera out of his bag, held it at arm's length away from them both, and attempted to take a photo. The photograph that printed out wasn't perfect, but it was a perfect memento to remember the day with. "Excusez-moi, would you like us to take a picture for you?" a voice with a heavy French accent said over their shoulder. Hamlet and Toots turned around and their mouths hung open with surprise. A pair of real French guinea pigs stood behind them, smiling and offering out their hands towards them. Hamlet cleared his throat and tried his hardest to sound as French as possible. "Merci, mes amis. That would be très bien," he bumbled, handing over his camera. The blonde French guinea pig with a sleek quiff and wearing a leather jacket snapped a photo of them before handing the camera back. "Merci," Toots thanked the French guinea pig. "Merci beaucoup." "De rien," the French guinea pig replied, before smoothly sauntering away past the Eiffel Tower. As the French guinea pigs toddled off, Hamlet pulled off his fake moustache and whispered to Toots, "They are even cooler than I imagined." The day had been wonderfully idyllic, but the sun was starting to set over Paris, and the guinea pigs knew Miss Fudge would be back at the apartment soon. They needed to be home before she was. Checking their map, Hamlet and Toots realised that they were far from Miss Fudge's family apartment. It would take a while to get back there on foot, maybe hours. "How are we going to get back in time?" Toots pondered, looking around for inspiration. Their eyes surveyed the area and landed upon a selection of rental bikes parked up against an iron fence. Hamlet had an idea. "Mademoiselle, it is time to get you home," he said, gesturing to the bicycles with a flourish. Toots giggled as they scurried over to the bicycle that a woman was preparing to set off on. Toots climbed into the wicker basket at the front of the bike, and Hamlet climbed in alongside her. They snuggled in amongst the baguettes and vegetables that the woman had packed into the basket, and settled in for the ride home. As the woman started pedalling and the bicycle wheels clicked and spun, Hamlet and Toots laid back to enjoy the peaceful ride. They would hop out of the wicker basket when they noticed they were closer to home. But for now, they watched the city fly by from the comfort of their makeshift nest. The cozy wicker basket reminded them of their comfy bed of straw back in their cage at the apartment. The tiny tourists closed their eyes sleepily, imagining that they were back home already, dozing off with the city of Paris as their backdrop. High on a mountaintop in Sleepy Forest, a baby dragon was getting ready to hatch from its egg. The parents of the dragon held hands and waited for their little one to appear. A single crack zigzagged down the glittering purple surface of the egg. The mother dragon said, "Oh, I wonder what our baby will look like. I wonder if they'll know how to fly." The father dragon smiled. Dragons are born knowing how to fly. Another crack ran down the egg. "What shall we call our little one?" the mother dragon asked. "We still haven't decided on a name yet." The father dragon replied wisely, "As soon as we see our baby, we'll know which name is perfect for them." A third crack appeared on the egg and ran all the way around it. The purple egg began to jiggle from side to side, as though the little dragon inside just could not wait another minute to get out. The egg rolled over and broke completely open. A baby dragon, with skin the colour of freshly opened leaves, jumped up and smiled up at his parents. His proud parents looked into his emerald green eyes and fell totally in love with him. To their surprise, their son began to do something quite unexpected. The little dragon shuffled his feet along the ground, waved his arms in the air, and wiggled his little dragon bottom. The mother dragon whispered, "What's he doing?" "I'm not sure," the father dragon whispered back. "Maybe he's got an itch that he needs to scratch." The confused parents looked more closely at their beautiful son. The little dragon nodded his head in time to a silent rhythm and tapped his feet on the ground. He clicked his fingers and began to hum a joyful tune. Then he jigged from side to side and kicked his legs in the air. He waved happily at his parents as he moved around. His mother and father waved back, but they didn't know why their son was moving in such a peculiar way. Just at that moment, a beautiful owl landed on the branch of a nearby tree. She fluffed her white feathers and settled herself more comfortably on the branch. She smiled at the parents and said congratulations to them on the birth of their son. The parents kept their eyes on their son, but moved closer to the owl and asked if she knew what he was doing. "Dancing," the owl replied. And very good he is, too. He's got a good rhythm going on there. Look at him go. He's making me want to dance, too. The owl started to bop up and down on the branch. The mother dragon said, But dragons don't dance. We fly, and we walk, and sometimes we run if we have to, but mainly we fly. The owl gave the parents a knowing look. You used to dance, don't you remember? Didn't you two meet at a moonlight disco years ago? Isn't that where you fell in love with each other? A dreamy look came into the parents' eyes, and they gazed fondly at each other. The mother dragon said, Oh, yes, we did meet at a moonlight disco. I've been so busy flying here, there, and everywhere that I've forgotten we used to dance. Your son was born with a love of dance in his heart, the owl said. Has he got a name? Oh, we forgot about that, the father dragon said. But I have the perfect name for him. The parents went over to their dancing son and held out their arms to him. The little dragon danced over to them and into their arms. In a voice full of love, the father dragon said, Disco. Your name is Disco. We've been waiting all day for you to come out of your egg. Disco repeated his name. He grinned, nodded, and said his name a few more times, as if he couldn't get enough of it. Then he jumped out of his parents' embrace and began to dance around the broken eggshell, whilst singing his name over and over again, and clicking his fingers and tapping his toes. The sight of their happy son made the mother and father dragon laugh in delight. They attempted to join in with his dancing moves, but they couldn't quite remember what to do, and gave up after a while. Disco danced a little longer before flopping to the ground and falling fast asleep. The next day, the proud parents introduced Disco to the other dragons who lived on the mountain. Disco shyly said hello to the gathering of dragons, and then he began to dance. He just couldn't help himself. His feet just had to hop from side to side. His arms just had to wave back and forth. And his body just had to twirl and whirl around. The other dragons were astonished and asked the parents what Disco was doing. Dancing, Mother Dragon replied, with a loving smile on her face. But dragons don't dance, an elderly dragon said. We fly, and we walk, and sometimes we run if we have to, but mainly we fly. Mother Dragon nodded. That's what I thought, but then I remembered that we all used to dance. But we were so busy flying here, there, and everywhere that we forgot how to. Do you remember how to dance? The elderly dragon frowned, as though searching for a memory. He said, I'm not sure. Did we really dance? Mother Dragon nodded. We did. Disco was born knowing how to dance. He's got a natural rhythm in his heart, one that we all have. I keep trying to copy him, but my feet trip over each other. But I'm certain I'll remember how to dance again soon." The elderly dragon smiled. "I hope I remember too. Look at the fun Disco is having." The little dragon continued dancing and added a few wiggles and jiggles. He shimmied back and forth along the ground, humming happily to himself. Such was the joy on his little face that the other dragons began to smile. Some of them even tried to dance too, but they kept bumping into each other and had to keep saying sorry. Disco kindly showed them some of his simpler moves, but that didn't work either, and 2 young dragons ended up with their tails somehow tied together. The elderly dragon said, "I can see how good Disco is at dancing, but can he fly?" "Oh, we forgot about that," Mother Dragon said. Father Dragon asked Disco if he would like to learn how to fly. Disco said he would like that very much. His parents took him to the edge of the mountain and showed him how to open his wings and flap them back and forth. Disco copied them and soon found a rhythm in the flapping of his wings. His feet jigged merrily from side to side, as though dancing to the movement of his wings. When he was ready, his parents showed Disco how to soar into the sky. Disco's little face frowned in concentration as he launched himself into the air. The wind rushed beneath his wings and took him higher and higher. The little dragon smiled. He veered to the left and then to the right. Flying was amazing, totally amazing, and Disco loved it. He looked down and realized he could see the whole of Sleepy Forest below him. He saw lots of forest animals. Some were moving through the long grass, and others were grazing in the flower meadows. A few were wallowing happily in the rivers, and some were asleep in the trees. To his surprise and delight, he noticed some elephants were actually dancing. Disco had never seen anyone else dance before. He swooped a bit lower to get a better look. The group of dancing elephants saw him and waved their trunks in a cheery hello. Disco waved back. The need to dance was too strong for Disco to resist. He flew to the nearest mountain and landed on top of it. He folded his wings behind his back and began to boogie and bop. He twisted and twirled this way and that, and waved his arms around in the air. He hummed a happy tune. It was a melody that came straight from his heart. His parents landed next to him and watched lovingly as their little dancing dragon boogied cheerfully on the mountain top. He was a joy to watch. After a while, the dragon family took to the skies again. But even though Disco loved flying with his parents, the second they landed, he began to dance. He just couldn't help it. His parents loved flying with their son too, but they could see how much his face lit up with pure happiness every time he danced. After discussing the matter between themselves, they came up with an idea. That evening, as the dragon family were roasting marshmallows on an open fire, the mother dragon smiled fondly at Disco and said, "We've been thinking about how much you love dancing." With his cheeks full of warm marshmallows, Disco nodded. He did love dancing very much. Mother Dragon continued, "And we thought it would be wonderful if you met other animals who love dancing too. Perhaps you could even dance with them." Disco quickly swallowed the marshmallows. "Really? I would love that. When we were flying earlier, I saw some dancing elephants down in the forest. I'd love to meet them. Do you think they'd like to meet me?" "Of course they would," his father said. "You are an amazing little dragon with a very special talent." His mother said, "You should fly down to the forest tomorrow and meet those elephants. You might meet other animals who can dance too. And when you come back home later, you can show us any new moves you've learned. Perhaps the right dance will help us remember how to dance again." Disco promised to learn as many new dances as he could. He was sure one of them would be perfect for his parents. Early the next morning, Disco said goodbye to his parents and set off on his dancing adventure. He flew over the tops of the snow-capped mountains and swooped down to the forest. He landed near the elephants, who were dancing again. The elephants didn't notice the dragon at first, because they were too absorbed in the dance they were doing. The elephants had arranged themselves into a circle, and as they jigged to the left and then to the right, their long trunks waved joyfully in the air. An older elephant was sitting in the shade of a tree, playing a merry tune on a big drum. Disco watched the elephants as they shimmied to the right and then skipped to the left, moving in perfect time to the beat of the drum. Before too long, Disco felt the rhythm catching a hold of him. His feet began to tap, and his fingers clicked in time to the music. He moved closer to the elephants and watched their skipping feet. One of the smaller elephants noticed him, and with a smile she made space for Disco in the circle. Disco grinned happily and joined the dancing elephants. His steps were in perfect time with theirs, and he even added a little wiggle and whirl now and again. The elephants noticed his fancy moves and copied him. Soon, the elephants and the dragon had made up a completely new dance. When the dance had finished, Disco introduced himself and said thank you to the elephants for letting him join them. The small elephant said, "That was our first dance of the day. We're going to do another one now. You can join us if you like." "Do you know how to do the conga?" Disco said he didn't, but he liked the sound of it. The elephants organised themselves into a line, with Disco in the middle. Using their trunks, tails, and in Disco's case, their wings, the animals made a long line that stretched back into the trees. The elephant with the drum began to tap out an upbeat rhythm on his instrument, and off the animals went, dancing the conga through the forest. 4 steps and a kick to the left. 4 steps and a kick to the right. Disco picked up the movements in no time. It was a wonderfully happy dance, and it made him laugh with utter joy. He thought about the dragons back on the mountain, and was certain they'd be able to do the conga dance too. He would teach them the moves later. The elephants and the little dragon congaed through the forest with the drumming elephant jigging behind them, never once losing the beat on his drum. After a while, the elephants came to a stop, and the largest one told Disco their dancing was over for the day. But if Disco wanted to find more animals who loved dancing, he should visit the porcupine family, because they would be doing their morning ballet soon. They told him which way to go through the forest. Disco thanked the elephants again, and then went on his way. He had no idea what ballet was, but he'd find out soon. A few minutes later, he found the porcupine family. There were 5 of them, and they were standing on their tiptoes and gently twirling on the spot. They slowly swayed to the left and then to the right. Their arms held out elegantly, reaching to the sky. Disco thought they looked very graceful, and he was certain he'd never be able to move like that. The mother porcupine noticed the little dragon and welcomed him warmly. She said, "Are you the dancing dragon? I've seen you dancing on the mountain tops." Disco nodded. "I love dancing, but I don't think I could do what you're doing, though." She smiled at him and said, "You don't know until you try. Watch what I do and do the same." She held her arms out and waved them gently in the air, like ripples on a river. Disco copied her movements, and to his surprise, he discovered he was rather good at it. The porcupines showed him some more ballet moves, and even though some were trickier than others, Disco tried his best and did very well. He had a wonderful time. When the ballet dancing came to an end, the porcupines asked the little dragon to show them some of his dance moves. Disco boogied and shimmied. He whirled and he twirled. He bopped and hopped to his own beat. The porcupines followed his moves and mixed in some of their ballet movements too. And very soon, the dragon and the porcupines had made up a completely new dance. Disco showed the porcupines how to do the conga, which they absolutely loved. When the dancing was over, the porcupines thanked Disco for spending some time with them, and said if he wanted to meet other dancing animals, he should find the pink flamingos down by the riverbank. They showed him which way to go, and then said goodbye to the dancing dragon. Disco headed to the riverbank, practicing some of his new ballet moves along the way. He soon came to a group of bright pink flamingos who were standing along the riverbank. Disco was amazed to see that they were all balancing on one leg. The flamingos looked like they were waiting for something to happen. Disco waited too. And then something did happen. A turtle shuffled through the forest with a violin in her hands. "Sorry I'm late," she said. "I slept in. I just couldn't get out of my comfy shell this morning." She moved over to the waiting flamingos, sat down, and tucked the violin under her chin. She began to play a beautiful song. The sound of it caused the flamingos to start dancing along the riverbank in long, graceful strides with their heads held high. They strutted to the left, clicked their fingers 3 times, and then strutted to the right, before twirling around and starting their movements all over again. Disco's feet tapped to the rhythm of the turtle's tune. One of the flamingos noticed Disco and waved him over. He made room for the dragon and showed him how to strut in time with the others. It didn't take long for Disco to pick up the movements, and he enjoyed moving back and forth with the brightly coloured birds. He particularly liked the twirling around parts, and couldn't help adding an extra twirl and a double whirl sometimes. He added a couple of bops too. The flamingos noticed his moves and copied him, and soon a new dance was created. Disco stayed with the flamingos for a while and learned more of their dances, and in return he showed them some of the new ones he'd learned that day. He wasn't surprised to find out they loved doing the conga. After a while, the dancing came to an end, and the flamingos said they had to fly, but told Disco that if he wanted to continue dancing, he should head deeper into the forest, where he would find lots of animals who loved to dance. The little dragon thanked them and watched the pink birds as they flew away over the trees. He walked further into the forest until he heard the sound of music coming from somewhere. He followed the melody and arrived at a clearing where a trio of gorillas were playing guitars. Other gorillas were dancing in pairs and moving smoothly back and forth across the grass. Now and again, one of the dancing gorillas would spin around and dip to the ground whilst holding hands with their partner. The music was joyful, and Disco found himself bopping from side to side. The gorillas saw him and invited him to join them. Disco partnered up with a gorilla who was about his size, and soon the pair were waltzing around the ground as elegantly as the others. Disco couldn't help adding his own touches, with a spin here and a kicking leg there. His moves impressed the gorillas, and they did the same as the little dragon. And it wasn't long before the gorillas and the dragon were moving to a new dance. Disco stayed with the grooving gorillas a while longer, and even learned how to strum the guitar. Everyone was being so kind to him. He carried on through Sleepy Forest, on the lookout for more dancing animals. Disco soon came across a couple of red-furred foxes who taught him how to foxtrot through the blackberry bushes. Then he met a kind-faced panda who showed him how to perform a slow shuffle beneath the shady boughs of an old oak tree. Later on, he joined a dozen stripy tigers as they performed a tango across a wooden bridge, their tiger feet and dragon feet tapping a beat on the wood. Some time later, Disco took a rest at the side of a river and gazed in wonder as a group of smiling otters performed a synchronized swimming dance through the water. They asked Disco to join them, but he didn't like the idea of getting his feet wet. So he stood up and copied their movements on the dry land instead. The day wore on, and Disco carried on dancing with different animals. He boogied with badgers outside their burrows. He sambered with squirrels as they danced around a large tree. He met an elderly monkey who did a mamba whilst playing the mandolin. And he had a fabulous time dancing with some cheerful chipmunks who hopped and bopped through the forest. Disco had a wonderful time learning lots of new dance moves, and an even better time making new friends along the way. Most of all, Disco thought that making up new dances with the other animals was the best fun of all. The sun made its slow journey across the sky and headed towards the horizon. The first star of the night twinkled into view. The little dragon began to feel tired, and he couldn't stop himself from yawning. It was time for him to go home. He opened his wings and flew into the sky. But even though he was tired, his dragon feet still jigged a little jig as the memory of the day's dances lingered in his mind. As Disco flew through the darkening sky, he thought about the animals he'd met and all the dancing they'd done together. He'd had an amazing time and couldn't wait to do it all again. His mother and father were waiting for him on the mountain top. They hugged him
and asked him about his day. The little dragon still had a small amount of energy left, so he showed his parents some of his new moves. More stars appeared, and a full moon shone down on the little dancing dragon. Disco was lost in the magic of his dancing and closed his eyes. He listened to the sounds of the night. Hoots came from treetop owls. A nightingale sang sweetly. The soft calls of Goodnight echoed through the forest on the evening breeze. Disco felt the rhythm of the night surrounding him, like a soothing lullaby of relaxing sounds. He swayed gently from side to side. So lost was he in his nighttime dance that Disco didn't notice that all the other dragons on the mountain had silently gathered around him. They saw how slowly he was dancing, and how his wings gently opened and closed as though he was flying. The dragons began to copy his soothing dance, and they softly swayed to the melody of the evening too. They smiled gently at each other. This was a dance they could all do easily. Still with his eyes closed, Disco yawned, and yawned again. His feet finally came to a stop. Mother Dragon scooped her son into her arms and took him into their cozy cave. She placed him in his bed and tucked a warm cover around him. She kissed him goodnight. She returned to the dragons and joined them as they danced their special nighttime dance. Very soon, and one by one, the dragons remembered how to dance. The moon shone down brightly on the dancing dragons as they discoed merrily through the night.
Adrenaline the Tortoise by Gillian Rogerson. It was early morning in Sleepy Forest, and the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon. The woodland animals were still fast asleep, snug in their beds, apart from one. Adrenaline the Tortoise was already awake. He'd woken up early because he liked filling his day with activities. There was always something to do, and always something to see. He got out of bed and had a good stretch. He washed his face and brushed his teeth. He put on his running shoes. They had blue stripes down the side of them, and Adrenaline was certain the stripes made him go faster. He left his little house and walked as fast as a tortoise could down the lane. He heard the light chattering of birds nearby and knew they were getting ready to begin their dawn chorus. Adrenaline loved joining in with them. Adrenaline waved to a robin who was perched on a fence and quietly practicing her latest tune.
a group of wrens were sitting on the bough of a tree and fluffing up their feathers in readiness for the morning symphony to start. Adrenaline climbed onto a small rock and joined a goldfinch who was already sitting there. They gave each other cheery good mornings before getting ready to sing. A rooster with a plume of purple tail feathers stepped forward regally. He cleared his throat and brought the light chattering to a stop. He bowed his head in greeting and then nodded at the gathering of feathered singers and the tortoise. The singing began. The tune was light and carefree. It drifted over the forest and gently woke the animals who were stirring from their sleep. Adrenaline didn't know any of the words to the song, but he sang as loudly as he could and with as much enthusiasm as he could. He even had a little dance. Soon the song came to an end. The birds wished each other a joyful day before flying away in different directions. Adrenaline climbed off the rock and went on his way. He hastened through the forest, his little legs going as fast as they could. He called out "Good morning" to everyone he saw. He soon came to a company of caterpillars who were searching the ground for fallen leaves. Adrenaline asked if they needed help. The biggest caterpillar said, "Yes, please. We need as many leaves as we can. We're always hungry lately, and we need to eat all day long." The little tortoise began to gather leaves from beneath the trees. He took them back to the caterpillars, who began to munch on them immediately. They invited Adrenaline to stop for a while and eat some leaves too. He politely said no. He could see how hungry the caterpillars were. He wanted to make sure they had plenty to eat. So whilst the caterpillars were enjoying their leafy feast, Adrenaline continued collecting more and more leaves. He brought the collection back to the caterpillars and put them in a neat pile. The caterpillars thanked the tortoise and said they had plenty to eat now. Adrenaline went on his way, looking for something else to do. The sun rose higher in the sky, and the gentle heat felt soothing on Adrenaline's shell. He continued walking through Sleepy Forest, going as fast as a tortoise could go. Adrenaline came to a flower meadow and saw some frogs leaping joyfully through the grass as they travelled from one side of the meadow to the other. They looked like they were having a wonderful time. Adrenaline gave them a cheery wave. The frogs invited him to join them. Adrenaline didn't hesitate. He moved closer to the frogs and watched how they bent their legs before jumping into the air. He did a few practice hops and then followed the frogs through the meadow. He jumped as high as a tortoise could jump. The frogs said he was doing really well. They asked him to join them at the pond where they were going to jump from lily pad to lily pad. Adrenaline wasn't sure about that and admitted all the jumping had made him a little tired and he wasn't sure he had any hops left in his legs. And besides, he still had plenty of things to do and plenty of things to see. Adrenaline said goodbye to the frogs and carried on walking, his steps a little slower now. The sun moved across the sky some more. Birds sang sweetly from the treetops. A fox with fur the colour of autumn leaves strolled leisurely through the grass. Deer nuzzled at hedgerows that were sprinkled with ripe red berries. Adrenaline noticed some bushy-tailed squirrels scampering up and down a sycamore tree. He waved cheerfully to them and asked what they were doing. "Collecting nuts," they replied. "We need as many as we can." Adrenaline offered to help them. He found a couple of chestnuts on the ground. He picked them up and attempted to scamper up the tree just like the squirrels had done. He wasn't successful and kept sliding back down. Maybe tortoises weren't built for climbing trees. Adrenaline still wanted to help the squirrels, so he took a moment to consider the matter. He came up with an idea. He collected a pile of hazelnuts and acorns and placed them at the bottom of the tree. He began to throw the nuts up to the waiting squirrels. It took a few throws for Adrenaline to get the hang of it, but before long, he was throwing the nutty feast successfully up to the waiting paws of the squirrels. Even though he wanted to make sure the squirrels had as much food as they needed, the little tortoise began to get tired, and he couldn't throw the nuts as high. He was quite glad when the squirrels said they had enough food. They thanked Adrenaline for his help. The little tortoise walked on through the forest at a much slower pace. There were still things he wanted to see and things he wanted to do. The sun continued slowly on its journey through the clear blue sky. Bumblebees flitted from flower to flower. A lavender-scented breeze flowed through sleepy forest. Adrenaline strolled along, looking for something to do. He spotted Hare resting at the side of the forest path. She was reclining on the soft grass with her hands behind her head. Adrenaline smiled. He had seen Hare many times running through the forest with a big smile on her face. Perhaps he could run with her. He wasn't sure he'd be able to go as fast as Hare, but he would go as fast as a tortoise could. He walked over to Hare and was surprised to see her eyes were closed. Was she asleep? At this time of day? How peculiar. Adrenaline was about to turn away, but Hare's eyes opened. She looked at the little tortoise and gave him a sleepy smile. "Hello there, Adrenaline. How are you today?" "I'm very well. Thank you for asking." He frowned a little. "Were you asleep, Hare? In the middle of the day?" Hare nodded. "I was having a nap. I have one every day at about this time." Adrenaline said he had no idea what a nap was. "Oh, it's a small, refreshing sleep," she explained. "Lots of animals have them." Adrenaline said he'd never had a nap, and he didn't like the idea of falling asleep in the middle of the day. Hare gave him a gentle smile. "You should try having one. It gives your body time to slow down and rest for a while. And it doesn't even need to be a long nap. Just long enough so that you feel rested afterwards and ready to get on with your day. I love having a nap." Adrenaline thought about her words. "Maybe I'll try a nap another day. I've got too much to do today." He let out the smallest of yawns. Hare noticed his yawn and said he should get an early night. Adrenaline shook his head. I've got too much to do. You'll feel better after a good night's sleep. I always do. I have lots of energy when I wake up. You've seen how fast I run through the forest, and that's because I have a good sleep. Hare stopped talking and looked as if she were searching for the right words. Sleeping is like a superpower. A superpower? Adrenaline liked the sound of that. What do you mean? Hare patted the grass next to her and asked Adrenaline to sit down. The little tortoise settled himself next to Hare. He lifted his face and felt the soothing warmth of the sun on his cheeks. Relaxing forest sounds came from all directions. Adrenaline listened to the soothing symphony of nature. He'd never noticed there was such a variety of sounds in Sleepy Forest before. He wriggled his feet inside his shoes and thought how nice it was to take a rest for a while. Hare said to Adrenaline, sleeping gives your body the time it needs to rest and grow stronger. I always feel amazing when I wake up. I'm ready for anything, and I'm sure I run faster too. I love going to bed early and getting as much sleep as I can. Why don't you try going to bed earlier tonight? Adrenaline was about to say he still had plenty of things to do that day, but he yawned instead. He just couldn't seem to stop himself. Hare continued talking gently to the tired tortoise. The other animals in the forest always go to bed early, and lots of them have naps too. Perhaps you should talk to them about it. Hare stood up and stretched her arms high above her head. I'm going for a run now. Would you like to join me? Adrenaline normally would have said yes, but his legs were feeling a little weary, so he politely said no and waved to Hare as she jogged away. Adrenaline thought about Hare's words. Was sleep really a superpower? He wanted to know what his forest friends thought about that. He lingered in the warm sun for a while longer, enjoying the feeling of having nothing to do. After a while, he stood up, wiped some grass off his running shoes, and set off walking again. He went as fast as a tortoise could go, a tortoise who was feeling somewhat tired. Adrenaline decided to revisit the squirrels and talk to them about what Hare had told him. When he reached the squirrels' home, he saw they were nestled cosily in the bough of the tree. Some of them were nibbling on small chunks of chestnuts. Adrenaline called up to them and asked if he could have a chat. Of course, the oldest squirrel said. I'll be down in a second. The squirrel scooted down the tree and arrived at Adrenaline's side. Adrenaline told him about his conversation with Hare and asked if the squirrels ever had naps. We certainly do. Every day. In fact, I've just had one, and I feel marvellous. I love having naps almost as much as I love going to sleep at night. I've got a cosy bed in this tree. It's made out of soft leaves. Adrenaline asked, "Do you think sleeping is a superpower?" Hare thinks it is. The squirrel smiled and said that was an excellent word to use. And yes, sleep must be a superpower, because he felt fantastic when he woke up after a good night's sleep. The squirrel looked at the tree, a thoughtful expression on his face. When I was little, I couldn't climb this tree. I kept sliding back down. My mum would always tell me to have a good sleep and try again the following day. When I woke up the next day, I was a little better at climbing, until one day I climbed all the way to the top. So, yes, I think sleeping must be a superpower. Adrenaline's little eyes grew wide in wonder. If I had lots of early nights, do you think I'd be able to climb your tree? You might. The squirrel smiled at him. Imagine that. Climbing our tree all the way to the top. Adrenaline was already imagining that very thing, and a smile spread across his face. He thanked the squirrel for talking to him and went on his way. Adrenaline walked on until he came to a stream where his frog friends were hopping from lily pad to lily pad. He waved to them and asked if they had time for a chat. The youngest frog jumped over to him. Adrenaline told her what Hare had said about sleep being a superpower. The frog nodded her green head enthusiastically. I know it is. She pointed to the lily pads. Last week, I couldn't jump between those lily pads. But now I can, and it must be because I've had lots of sleep. Adrenaline said he was very impressed. The frog lifted one leg and waggled it in the air. Look, I've grown bigger since last week. Look how long my legs are. She waggled it again. And next week, my legs will be even longer and stronger. Adrenaline asked if the frog ever had a nap during the day. Oh yes, every day. I've got a snuggly spot by the water. I love having a nap, but I like my sleep even more. Will you come back next week and see how much I've grown again? Adrenaline promised to do so. The frog tilted her head and looked more closely at the tortoise. She said, if you get lots of sleep and lots of naps, you can use your superpower to leap across the lily pads like me. Imagine that, Adrenaline said with a smile. A leaping tortoise. He said goodbye to the young frog and went on his way. It wasn't long before he came to the tree where the caterpillars were resting. They were lounging sleepily on the branches, contented smiles on their faces. Adrenaline noticed they weren't eating and asked if they'd run out of leaves. One of the caterpillars yawned and said, "We've eaten all we need to. It's time for our big sleep soon." Adrenaline wasn't sure what the caterpillar meant by that and asked her to explain. The caterpillar yawned again before saying, "In a caterpillar's life, there's a time to eat and there's a time to sleep. And it's nearly time for our big sleep. It's when we turn into butterflies." "Are you sure you don't want any more leaves? I can get some for you." "No, thank you. All I want to do now is close my eyes and fall into a deep, deep sleep. Good night, my kind friend. I'll see you again when I wake up." The caterpillar closed her eyes and pulled her cozy cocoon around herself. Seeing her look so restful and happy made Adrenaline want to be in his bed with his cozy cover around him. He yawned and blinked tiredly. He started to head home. Thoughts of his snuggly, cozy bed filled his mind, causing him to yawn some more. On the way home, he went by the area where the birds had started their dawn chorus that day. The rooster, with a plume of purple tail feathers, was resting beneath an oak tree, a relaxed smile on his face. A sleepy tiredness came over Adrenaline, and he asked the rooster if he could sit with him for a while. "Of course, my friend." The rooster's voice was deep and soothing. "Tell me about your day. You always seem to be off somewhere." Adrenaline told the rooster what he'd been doing. He finished by telling him about Hare and the conversations he'd had with the squirrel, the frog, and the caterpillar. The rooster nodded, a wise look on his face. "It's true. Sleeping is very good for you. And there's something else too. Something magical happens when you're asleep. Your mind is free to imagine whatever it wants." Adrenaline wasn't sure what that meant and asked the rooster to explain. The rooster gazed dreamily into the distance and said, "When I fall asleep, I often get ideas for new songs. The words come to me in dreams. When I wake up, I remember the songs and I write them down in a notebook. The other birds do that too. It's amazing what happens in your dreams. It's like being transported into another world, a magical world where anything is possible." Adrenaline loved the thought of being transported into a magical world. He said,
Do you think I will get ideas in my dreams too?
Of course. The rooster smiled at the little tortoise. I had a nap earlier and came up with a new song whilst I was asleep. Would you like to hear it? Adrenaline nodded. In his deep and soothing voice, the rooster began to sing. His beautiful melody filled the air and wrapped itself around Adrenaline like a comforting hug. The tortoise felt all warm inside, and he felt tired too. He began to yawn again. His eyes started to feel heavier and heavier. The sun dipped towards the horizon, and the sky turned a darker shade of blue. When the rooster had finished his lovely lullaby, Adrenaline said, "I'd better be getting home. I'm so very tired, and I'm ready for my bed. Thank you for singing to me. I loved your song. Good night." "Good night, little one. Sweet dreams." The rooster started up his song again, and the soothing melody drifted on the air and kept Adrenaline company on his short walk home. The tired tortoise soon arrived home. He took off his shoes and put them away. He brushed his teeth, washed his face, and got into his pajamas. He snuggled down in his comfy, cozy bed and pulled the cover up to his chin. He sighed happily. He imagined his friends in Sleepy Forest settling down to sleep too. He smiled sleepily as he thought about his body growing stronger in the night and the magical dreams that were waiting for him. He let out a long, long yawn. Adrenaline, the tired tortoise, fell into a deep, deep sleep.